what kind of forgiveness that should happen. And the second branch of forgiveness, like regarding to like genuine forgiveness, this only occurs when the victim forgive under their own accord to generally acknowledge and forget the mistake of the perpetrator. In which we believe that by
I
narrative, we don't see anyhow the victims is gonna like have this sort of kind of gonna give out this sort of forgiveness because of how the traumatic experiences the victim did. Moving on to the virtue, anything that's considered to be morally good or just. That is to say that an action that follows the moral basis and fundamentals of morality that brings benefit is considered to be virtue. Even though society goes around forgiveness being morally good, we say that forgiveness is not a virtue. Let's make it clear. The difference between forgiveness and virtue. The meaning of virtue is anything morally good, and from the value, forgiveness fills the criteria. However, forgiveness isn't necessarily morally good. Reason being, it is not in the best interest of the victim, even under genuine circumstances where they want to forgive. Will be elaborated further in my argument. So, what are the contexts of this debate? We say this debate should be contextual in a world where victims and perpetrators are unable to move on from past hurts and complex emotions, in which this like debate runs more on victims who have like face like traumatic experience like rape victims where their rights are being like violated and them like being and like their rights has been taken away by this perpetrator, in which we don't see any sort of reason how these victims should forgive the perpetrator because of what they have done, what they have committed towards the victim. Before I move on towards my argument, any POIs?
Yes, sir. Now you said that we are pressured in our world. People are victim of pressure to be forgiving. Now, don't you think that people are actually recommending them to forgive?
Okay. Because of how the narrative is provided by society, of course, it's going to be a societal pressure. They're going to pressure the victim into forgiving the perpetrator, regardless of how you're going to say like it's like suggesting and so on. However, even if that's not the case, we say because of how like the narrative is already embedded within society. Therefore, regardless of what you think, the victim will still have to like be pressured into like into like doing to forgive rather or for the victims to make decisions. To some individual, forgiving someone for their past actions can be difficult. What this means that we will see society coercing the victim to reopen old wounds, claiming that it's part of the process of forgiving. This is coercion because it gives the individual no choice to make their own decision. The virtue of forgiving is indoctrinated in the person since young, leaving the child no choice but to listen to it. This also means that they would not know any other alternative but to forgive. The reason why this is unvirtuous is because if the moral compass of the people is one that was coerced into them, that makes the decision of the forgiving to be unvirtuous in itself, because it's one of the ingenuine. Society also places a strong emphasis on being forgiving in order to achieve high morale, which is like resulted into pressure. For example, experience reminding past loved one and the tragedy that occurred. Therefore, they would be reluctant to forgive because they're unprepared to face their perpetrator. But if the individual is unable to forgive, society will then seek to test the individual. Others, it looks like if individuals seen as spiteful or to have a deficit in understanding others, a constant derogatory words being thrown on that person, adding on the pressure to forgive, alienation of the individual from communities and groups, which will result in the reason as to why they will be like pressured into like forgiveness because of how if they don't like forgive that victim person, they will be alienated from the society, which could overhurt the victim more, in which they will just have to like forgive in order for them to be accepted by society. What are the impacts of this particular argument? So we say that it will furthermore internalize their pain. We say they will like suffer alone. They will like also be afraid to voice out because of how when they try to like not to forgive the person, of like having a strong sense of not wanting to forgive the person, we say it's gonna be hard for them to voice out like the problems and like the acts they have done by this perpetrator. In which we believe that this like the constant victim blaming happening on site opposite because of how the narratives because they wanted to defend that particular war. Moving on to the second argument, the virtue undermines minorities and social movement. Minorities are disfranchised daily through ineffective government and legislation. For example, ineffective welfare, ineffective affirmative action, constant ignorance towards the root cause of the problem, i.e. systematic barriers. The virtue of forgiveness pressure minorities to forgive and forget this ineffective system. Why is it so? Due to the power of animosity, it goes to minorities, often the ones with the least social capital in the society because of number one, they're demographic. Number two, the glass ceiling that blocks them from ever achieving the progress. Hence, they have no capacity to overrule the narrative cycle of passion in which they are unable to like voice out their opinions and having a strong stance regarding to what the government has done. Instead of them like making a protest regarding that the government has done wrong, not catering towards the minorities and more on like catering towards the majority, we said it will only happen more by having some narratives because of how society pressures the minorities to further internalize their pain, to further internalize their suffering because of how forgiveness is like being held is like being like glorified by society and so on. What are the impacts of this particular argument? So we see that minorities no longer have a voice despite being the most vulnerable in society that needs them. Societal movement have no incentive to push for legislative change because all they will do is try to understand government facing problems and why they cannot cater. So they won't even push for their own needs. In which we say that in like circumstances where government like it's technically like the government failure for like having like the poor being a poor because of the failure of their welfare and so on. We say that's the reason as to why social good would cease to exist because of how they're becoming understanding. We said they wouldn't even try to advocate for theirs because of the fear of being backlashes by society and so on. What we see happening is that there exists like the BLM movement will cease to exist because of how like people think that the movement itself is radical and further stigmatization happens towards radical because of how they're being unforgiving towards the government and like those who like doesn't actually like accept the minority. So this creates a large generation of people who will always submit to authoritative state of their government while never achieving progress in human evolution. This is bad because we see that there's going to be no progress regarding to like freedom, regarding to like these political minorities, in which we believe that the minorities itself has like for so long have been oppressed by this authority state. We say there's no more reason for them to be more oppressed. Instead, we should give them an alternative. We said by regarding this narrative, it provides them a better way to like advocate for themselves. Therefore, with all that said, side with side government because we provide you because the narrative itself is considered to be wrong and immoral. Therefore, if you side with the victim, side with us. If you side with like the non-victim opposition, that's what we think.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 15 seconds. Now, let's invite Leader of Opposition to begin with her speech.
Hi, can I be seen and heard clearly? Thank you. Okay. Before I begin, I have no preferred gender pronouns and I prefer my POIs verbally so you can just unmute and POI me. Then I'll answer. Okay. If I answer. Right. Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 34. Verse 32. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you. Okay, I would like to start off my speech with a few points of rebuttal. First, they mentioned about how forgiveness is just coercion, right? However, we say that no one is actually coercing anyone into doing anything. Having something being a virtue means that something should be done, not it must be done. It is an example that people should follow, and it is strong enough to build up a united community. Forcing someone to forgive a person is not true forgiveness anyway, and we are not arguing on this premise today. Secondly, forcing people into thinking that they have to do this is actually embedded into society. We say that even if this was true, we say it is far better than the society that they are actually creating, where people will just be filled with hatred with others and filled with hatred for themselves as well, right? I would be terrified to live inside government's world of fear that if I were to do anything at all and it's not socially acceptable, I would be the one to be segregated and I would be the one to be seen as obscene because no one in the world will know the virtues and the moral values, virtues and the benefits of forgiveness. Third, If you're not forgiving, you will be alienated. I think the society is actually smart enough and compassionate enough to see the situations for themselves, right? However, this motion isn't actually about whether or not you are socially accepted by society. This is actually about dealing with the internalized problem with yourself and with the other person as well. Next, they talked about internalized pain, right? And how people have to swallow everything that they are faced with. We say that the opposite is actually true. People are more likely to express their pain due to the fact that open conversations is more likely to happen on our side of the house. How this looks like is that when people actually forgive others and or forgive themselves in certain situations, they know what they want into benefiting this situation, right? And they know that they know their own limits and they know when to stop. They know the black and white, and the only way that this can be achieved is if forgiveness is made a virtue. Now, let me actually go into a little bit of characterization on our side of the house so that things don't get too messy, right? Number one, forgiveness is seen as the stepping stone for acceptance. For something to be, a virtue, it actually has to be beneficial. And the reason why we want it to be a virtue is because putting it on this platform is able to encourage more people to do the same as well. And I'll explain why this is a good thing at the end of the day. Forgiving people, secondly, forgiving people doesn't mean that you accept their actions, or it doesn't mean that their actions are justified or that you believe that they don't have to face punishment, right? Forgiving people is actually an act that is meant to help both parties at the end of the day to move on. Even if the opposing party refuses to seek forgiveness, it is still important for you to forgive that person, not because that the perpetrator matters, but because if you don't, you can't ever move on, as the first step of forgiveness is to always accept what has happened to you first, right? This is important because a majority of victims of assault or like trauma will always go through a phase or still be stuck in a phase of denial. The reason why forgiveness is important is to allow them to actually move along the process of denials, bargaining, anger, depression, and finally acceptance much easier. Now, let's go into our yardstick, right? So what is actually going to go on and what's going to go down in today's debate? Number one, our first yardstick, which side actually creates a more accepting society with themselves and also with the other person as well. Secondly, which side is able to have a more peaceful society, net happiness at the end of the day. And third of all, this is a burden on government to prove, is that they must show that victims can move on without forgiving said experience. Okay, so with that out of the way, what am I going to be talking about today? I'm going to go into three things. Number one, I'm going to say how forgiveness is very beneficial. Number two, I'm going to talk about how even if forgiveness doesn't physically benefit a party, it is still very emotionally beneficial. And last but not least, I'm going to talk about how even when it is not physically beneficial or it's not emotionally beneficial, forgiving people still makes this world a much better place as opposed to said government's world. Okay, now, so how is forgiveness actually beneficial, and how does this work? People are more inclined to do it to be forgiving when it is seen as a virtue. Now, as a virtue implies that it is a principled justification to do so. All principles are based on the principle of freedom, i.e., the right to life, the right to vote. Therefore, in order for these victims to actually have some sort of freedom for their past trauma, they ought to forgive, as that is the only exclusive way that they can accept what has happened to them and finally be free. Okay, forgiveness can even lead to like feelings of like understanding, empathy, and like compassion for the one who has hurt you, right? So forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing the harm done to you or making up with the person who caused the harm, right? It doesn't have to mean those things. Forgiveness brings a kind of peace that actually helps you go on with life, and not to mention how it is never wrong to forgive someone even if they don't apologize, right? Why is this important? If we don't have the forgiveness as a virtue, people tend to forget how important it is to truly accept the fact that some things cannot be changed. And without knowing it evidently that forgiveness is something that is ultimately good, people are more inclined to not forgive at all. You will create a very angry, very upset society, right? So what is the impact of this? People are able to forgive themselves first, and then this actually mitigates a lot of the harms, such as creating a society that holds grudges with others and also with themselves as well. Okay, now let's go into my second part. Even when forgiveness isn't physically beneficial, it is actually emotionally beneficial. So what does this mean? Such as the harms brought upon by side government, right? Forgiveness may not always be good, and it leads you to be like being trampled on by others, or maybe being trampled on by others, or maybe you don't get the satisfaction as you do when someone is condemned, right? But we say that the emotional benefit that our own moral compass provides for us is much better, and much better, and it lets us grow as people. It is very important to know that forgiveness being a virtue only empowers more people to stand up for themselves and know what they want. Be the bigger people and be stronger. Now, third part, even when it is neither, even when forgiveness is totally not beneficial physically, not beneficial emotionally, we say it is still going to be much better than this terrible, very terrible world that side government is pushing onto us, right? People are able to look past their past mistakes easier, right? We never become angry. We never become angry with our hand when we accidentally cut our finger. This is because forgiveness actually allows us to accept that this is an accident, and the reason why we say that this is true is because forgiveness being a virtue lets us be very sure that it is a good thing by being accepting with ourselves. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, with all the things above, I've told you, number one, about how side government's world is actually proposing that we live in a very gray, very red, very angry, very upset world where people don't even want to look each other in the eye. Other than that, the next situation that can arise is if we were living in side government's world, side government's world, it will be even more difficult to stay alive and to be happy, because people will then be having all their eyes on you, being ready to condemn you at any moment. With that, and all the benefits that I've provided about forgiveness being a virtue, never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 9 seconds. Now, let's invite Deputy Prime Minister to deliver his speech.
Hello, am I audible? I'll take that as a yes. Give me a moment to arrange my speech. All right, I'll prefer my POIs in chat. I have no gender preference. You can refer to me as anything. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to start my speech with two things. Firstly, the process of forgiveness and how it's inherently coercive. And secondly, social movements and minorities, which is something that opposition never dealt with. But before that, let's take a look at their comparative, right? Just a quick clarification. What opposition has to defend is a world where individuals are inherently coerced from young to have forgiveness ingrained in them. This is because parents often tell us that we need to move on and we cannot be childish and always stick on to our revenge attitude, right? That forgiveness is more when it only causes more victims and regret on the ones that we owe the most obligation to, because forgiveness is coercive and the phases of forgiveness is irreversible. Opposition then talk about how we need to prove how we can actually move on. Sure thing, but take note that on opposition side of the house, the reason why they actually cannot move on is because of two reasons. Firstly, the fact that forgiveness is actually irreversible causes them to always regret on their actions about why they actually forgive in the first place. But secondly, the fact that they actually forgive means that the perpetrators actually did a moral wrong towards them. That is to say, when these perpetrators actually cause you, like your image and how they actually refuse to recognize your human dignity and cause a moral wrong towards you, that is when you are going to not be able to move on, because you have to internalize your anger towards these individuals who refuse to identify you as a human being and respect you as mankind. But secondly, it's not about moving on, but it's about how the extent of harms that you cause towards other individuals, which is based on the premise of morality, and that's the criteria in which we actually win. First, touch down on the process of forgiveness and how it's inherently coercive. Firstly, I'll explain why it's coercive and see and compare that with what opposition had said and explain, even if it wasn't coercive, how it still is immoral. Firstly, then, we told you from first that this narrative was coercive because of two reasons. Firstly, that it has been ingrained in society from young, and secondly, that there's a societal pressure to forgive because society shames those who don't forgive. Therefore, what we need is a counter narrative that is able to counter the harms of intrinsically causing individuals to forgive reluctantly and move on. Proper opposition then argues as to how it is not coercive, but it is about morality. But look at their language, right? Look at their language. Forgiveness is a sign of morality that people should follow. That is exactly what they said in the first 30 seconds of their speech, and they've already conceded to our analysis on how it was coercive. They then talked about how open conversations happen more on their side. Two main responses. Firstly, when your side specifically shames those who don't forgive because they face alienation, in which leader of opposition themselves also said that literally is the reason why it is coercive in the first place. But secondly, you cannot express your anger at all. To apologize is to accept that forgive is to accept that the perpetrator did something wrong. But we said it when your perpetrator has done some immoral wrong towards you, it is unacceptable for you to simply forgive because your side says how people want open conversations to actually have a nice healthy discourse. But when this person has done a moral wrong, it is and you forgive them, this is the phase in which it's irreversible because you have shown that you've moved on from this process and therefore you forgive them for their actions. That is why it's irreversible. And at the same time, you cannot show your anger because you've forgiven them. That is to say, you understand their life circumstances and their actions. That is why you still have to internalize your emotions on opposition. Secondly, then, even if it wasn't coercive, how it is still immoral. This takes opposition at their best case and assume that it was a recommended alternative. Why then is it harmful? Because first, you prioritize yourself for peace while causing the perpetrator to cause more harms to other victims. But note, we would even argue that individuals won't have peace because how these crimes are mostly traumatic and the process in which you have to go through to provide and justify your forgiveness is simply difficult because the victims have to go through an emotional baggage, again, because of how they have to relive the experiences of having their human dignity refused to be recognized. But secondly, that you cause more victims. I'll specifically flag this out for you in my arguments and how it actually happens. But secondly, clash then on social movements. Notice that this was never engaged with, and this was specifically crucial because opposition fails to provide justice for those who we owe most obligations to. Opposition then tried to argue on how we cause angry societies. But I just want you to use your imagination, right? Just imagine you are an individual in a marginalized community where the government has stripped your rights away because of an arbitrary factor that is your race, your gender, and your skin color. But secondly, we said we prefer anger over a world where minorities are passive and don't fight for their rights. We flip their claim and say that anger is actually good because it enables for the minorities to voice out their concerns and actually fight for their rights. But then they talk about how forgiveness happens. Forgiveness happens when we cut our own hand. Like literally, you literally claim that it was an accident. So therefore, of course, we will forgive ourselves because it's literally an accident. You know what? In the instance where it is a moral wrong, these perpetrators are intentionally causing a moral wrong towards you. Therefore, this example from their side doesn't stand. Before I move on to my arguments, I'll defend yourself. No POIs. All right. Moving on to my arguments on how forgiveness tears the social fabric in three key respects. The premise of my argument is that the emotion of feeling sincerely remorse is the prerequisite to apologies, which then leads to a decision made by the victim to forgive or to not. We're going to give you structural reasons why forgiveness isn't always necessarily the way to resolve problems, but to make it clear, as long as we tell you why it is morally abhorrent in the instance where the victim wants to forgive without coercion and how the perpetrator does feel remorse, we win this debate. Firstly, then, how forgiveness exacerbates abusive relationships. Relationships are unique bonds and romantic intimacies between two people who love each other. The problem with abusive relationships is that it inherently manipulates the victim and allows the abuser to use her as means to an end. This can range from physical abuse to mental constraint, where the abuser actively belittles the person that they claim to love and only using her as pleasure for their own satisfaction. The main reason why it's so frequent and common that victims do forgive their partner is because the abusers always guilt trip their victims. This looks like emphasizing guilt on your partner when they want to live independent lives and split the relationship by constantly pushing that you've taken them for so long, which then leads to jealousy for the victims, right? That is to say, individuals sacrifice a certain portion of happiness from the abuse to stay with partners because they feel as if no one else would accept them, hence why abusers belittle their victims in the first place. But secondly, forgiveness creates more victims. This is because forgiveness is in the eye of the perpetrator, is an explicit sign of weakness. The reason for this is because when victims choose to understand the choices and life circumstances, this opens the door for perpetrators to feel that it was the right decision to do. Hence, perpetrators then actively continue to commit their acts against other individuals. But even if you don't believe that, let's move on to the third layer, that is all of how forgiveness causes criminals to be disillusioned. This answers the question on how, even if these perpetrators feel remorse and how these individuals do want to forgive, why is it still immoral? This layer explicitly answers this question, and we told you that morality is a standard that's based by society in which could change over time. Thus, with that in mind, this causes more acts of moral wrong because of two reasons. First, the disprivileged minorities and the poor have been disenfranchised and neglected for centuries that lock them out from basic needs. What this then causes is that you actively give no alternative for these people, so they resort to crimes. This may be symmetric, but B, forgiveness on opposition's counterfactual further pushes these people to feel more justified in doing these crimes because first, forgiveness disillusions the poor or these people who are criminals into thinking that there will be public support and to justify their actions of crime. But secondly, that this happens on a scale. Of course, crime rates cannot be completely diminished under our side of the house, but the key point of contention here is on how they further incentivize these individuals to commit crimes. What are the impacts of this? Three things. First, you cause a stereotype that's far more exacerbated between you because you incentivize them to commit crimes because they think it's okay under their life circumstances. But two, you worsen more lives and leave a permanent traumatic experience that was caused by these perpetrators. And thirdly, forgiveness in between the victims and the abuser in abusive relationships leads to the exacerbation of domestic violence and worsens the most vulnerable livelihoods. Morality is a set standard by society on what is generally right and wrong, dependent on how it affects individuals. Because forgiveness leads to more victims and worsens the dignity of the most vulnerable, we say that the narrative of forgiveness was one that was morally unjust. And with that, I beg you to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 6 seconds. To continue, let's invite Deputy Leader of Opposition to begin with his speech.
Can I be heard and seen? Where's my timer? Start in 3, 2, 1. See, first of all, the problem here in today's debate is that they think that a world without forgiveness is actually good. You know why? Because in our world, because you see, the thing that is they need to prove for clarification from them is because that why forgiveness is unnecessary in order to heal or move on. You see, because it is important to move on or let go of your grudge so you can heal yourself mentally. And they need to specify in what world, in how is it, because you see how it is true. Because if you say sorry, for example, if you and your friend splash water to you, and then it is involuntary action, and then he says sorry to you, and then you say, okay, I forgive you, and then it puts a conclusion to that act. It puts a conclusion to that story. Now, what if you don't say sorry instead? In their world, you are disinclined to say sorry because forgiveness is not a virtue, because it's not something important anyway. So when that happens, if you don't say forgiveness, okay, even though you forgive him, you don't say it's okay, you don't forgive him verbally, and then you just move on. But your friend who involuntarily splashed water on you, and then he says sorry to you, and then he will feel, how do we feel? He will feel a burden. He will feel, oh my God, what is my friend feeling about me? How does he feel about me? Then this is the thing that he needs to prove on their side of the case. Now, first of all, and then side government also said that the victim is pressured. Okay, first of all, no, I'm sorry. We talk about their main case is that we don't talk about domestic violence. This is the second main case, domestic violence. Okay, first of all, this is more likely to happen, but domestic violence is more likely to happen in their case because why? If forgiveness is not a virtue, then how abuse how abuser will manipulate this is easy. Is that they will say this just okay. For example, if I am no, I'm sorry. If I have a friend who is if person A is an abuser, they abuse person B, and then person B just say I'm sorry, and then if the if in their world they forgive them, and then that doesn't matter to the one who is abused, then it will okay, how will they react? And then they abuse the one who is abused, they will forgive the abuser, no rejected, they won't forgive the abuser. And then how will the abuser react to this? The abuser will of course abuse them more, because why are you not forgiving me? You see, why do you I even go to the length of forgiving you? Why do you not care about me? Why do you not care about my opinion? Because you see, it even worsen the abuse, it even intensify the abuse. You see, in our world it is even better. Okay, and then moving on to my first argument. My first argument, I will talk about how society in our world has better mental health. See, like I said before, when we forgive, it gives up our grudge and it calms our soul. And we don't think, and this, what happens in their world is, if they don't think forgiveness is a virtue, then they think, oh, no need to do that. No need to do that. What this do is this is harmful to both the one who is a victim and the one who is the perpetrator. And then the perpetrator, by what I mean by perpetrator, is the one who is, for example, your friend, your mother, who is involuntarily. The one we would really want to condemn is the one we support in what you want to condemn is the criminals, the one who you do in the perpetrator in domestic violence. Those are the one we condemn. But what about the perpetrators? For example, your friends and these innocent people. Okay, well, how would they feel? You have not mentioned about them. Okay, and like I said before, because you feel that grudge, you feel that void, and because you have not yet been forgiven. Because you see, another thing, you see, what if I say, okay, I'm sorry, and then you can hold people accountable using that? Why? Because if you don't say sorry, and then yes.
The difference between our world is that perpetrators meant the action they had done. Like, for example, the person like Ted Bundy, he meant to rape those victims. However, in comparison with your world, which like accidents, we say accidents that can be forgiven because they don't actually meant to do that particular thing. So please get that right.
Sorry, I cannot hear you.
The difference between our world is that perpetrator actually meant to do that particular action. Like, for example, Ted Bundy actually meant to rape those women. In comparison with your world, where accident happens, of course you're going to be forgiven because it's considered an accident. Please get that right.
Okay. I only told you to that. You did not mention this type of perpetrators. And I only talked about, okay, what about in the case of Ted Bundy? Okay, let me mention him for you. Okay, first of all, what does this do if for the perpetrators, with the victim's family, they forgive these people? Okay, because they don't want this to affect their life. They don't want this, like every time they work or every time they work, they want to move on. Every time they work, every time they go on with their daily life, they don't want to think about Ted Bundy. They don't want to think about this guy. They want to move on. And forgiveness is a means to do that. That is why forgiveness is a virtue. Forgiveness must be a virtue. Because if you don't think forgiveness is a virtue, even if you forgive Ted Bundy, then you will think, I'm not moving on. I'm not doing the right thing. Actually, I want to beat up Ted Bundy. I want to go to his prison. I want to beat up. That is what will happen in your side. And also which also link to the side where you talk about how minority is being oppressed. No, minority is more oppressed in your side. Because why? First of all, if forgiveness is not a virtue, then okay, because this can happen in reverse also. Because if, for example, you do something wrong, because if the minority do something wrong, then no, I'm sorry. If the majority do something wrong and the minority don't forgive them, if the virtue is not, but then even if forgiveness is a virtue, they still won't be pressured. Yeah, because why? Evidence exists there, like the BLM movement. Did you see anyone forgiving the policeman for killing that George, that man? No, we don't see forgiveness. Even if in this world where forgiveness is a virtue, people still don't forgive the policemen who've done wrong. We don't still forgive the people who've done wrong. See, even if forgiveness is a virtue, it doesn't affect the criminal justice system. This world is fair right now. Now, it does not oppress the minority. The evidence is, you can see where years ago, where Black Lives Matter movement, it affects the whole world, even the whole world, even if in that world forgiveness is a virtue. That's what I'm telling you. And then second of all, my second argument is we talk about how society in the world has and second of all, how we have a better world. Okay, now first of all, the first speaker, he misheard my POI. If he actually heard my POI, first of all, he said that he thought that my POI was about that we are not pressuring people. No, my POI is about how, why, and why. Like my first argument just now, why is it forgiveness is unnecessary in order to heal or move on? That is why he is unheard of. He is unheard. Okay, now in the second argument, okay, my second argument, okay, we tell because even if, right, even if it is coerced, even if it is pressure, right, we are pressured to make people to have a much better mental health. We are pressured them to move on, to have a better life, to have a much peaceful world. That is what we are pressuring, even if it is a pressure. Now, that is why we are correct in all sides, in any angles, in any perspective, which is why we believe we better the world, we better the society to have a peaceful life, a peaceful world. And that is why we proudly stand against this motion.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 15 seconds. Let's invite Government Whip to begin with her speech.
I take POIs verbally, preferably after 6, because I do not want to be interrupted. Hold on. Let me sort out my notes. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. This narrative does nothing but reinforce the privilege to those in power while leaving the disenfranchised left to rot and to submit those around them. I'll be doing 2 things in my speech. First of all, a few extraneous rebuttals, most of all from the previous speaker, and second of all, one clash on the overarching metrics to judge today's debate. Firstly, on the extraneous rebuttals, I would like to point out a contradiction coming up from their deputy. They told us in the last part of their speech, saying that the people do not forgive the police that knew and were exploiting the status quo because that's too large of an impact and that's too large of a scale of harm for them to forgive them. We think this basically undermines everything Shana said about ensuring peace in society. Because if you want to get your case right, you have to forgive decades of oppression from colonialism, the impact of discrimination and disenfranchisement of minorities, or just simply police brutality, for example. You have to forgive all of this to ensure there is no hatred or resentment in society. We think for that reason, you cannot just shift your case for whenever it's convenient for you. We think they cannot stand. But second extraneous rebuttal then, they told us that they're not forcing anyone to do anything, and that virtue is meant to serve as an example and a recommendation for people to follow, and therefore it's strong enough to build a community. We think this sentence alone is contradictory. Let's then dissect it. The first part of it says no one is forced to do anything. The second part of it, the end part, says that it's strong enough to build a community. The first statement implies that victims have a choice to forgive, henceforth it's a recommendation. The second statement implies that the choice to forgive will be happening in masses, that is strong enough to build communities. This means, panel, even if victims have the choice to choose in their side of the house, the choice itself is dictated by the ways of communities in which they're fabricated. Hence, these societal standards by your community itself will be one that's coercive. Henceforth, we don't get why then would your side be any less coercive than or henceforth they do not vote. We posit to you simply that hate is not the corollary to forgiving, because the alternative proposition is that one where you're not ready, if you're not ready to go back on something, then because of the harm that it caused you, you're not going to go back on it because of its consequences that it's not been served. That means I'm not ready to go back on neutrality or to stop resenting you because I think you've done something bad. Therefore, there needs to be some sort of retributive consequences to your actions for me to heal. However, I will not forgive you now because of the harms and PTSD that has been done towards this mean? The positive virtue in opposition conceives people into thinking, coerces people into thinking that maybe something happened, maybe I was like harmed and abused. I still need to get on it and get past it. I don't have to reopen these wounds and look into them. I just need to move past them in order for my emotional state of being. Shauna also concedes to this when she says that forgiveness is the only way for people to move on. But we think that the impact is harmful because if society because this means the society doesn't care if the perpetrator has actually changed. They just want big public displays of forgiveness that doesn't actually change anything that led to those toxic behaviors existing. They just want a tokenistic band-aid on the problem that they caused without actually going into root and actually changing and deterring the problem from ever reoccurring. I'll take a POI before moving on.
Just now you talk that we are contradicting our case because we debated on whether or not on the base that this is being coerced, but actually we are debating in your case. This is why we did that.
Okay, then even if you're debating in our case, that means our case still stands. But also, if your case wasn't coercive, it's still one that's harmful because of the literal things we told you before in Ryan, for example, on the irreversibility of like the narrative in and of itself and how you, even if you're not able, even if you choose to forgive, you that choice may be something that you might go back to in the future, which is something I'll also touch on later in my points of weighing. Onto the clashes then. The main stakeholder that this clash will focus on is the victim. On proposition, we basically told you how we help the victim in terms of we empower them, we give them the ability to stand up for themselves and not be able to submit to the societal narrative of forgiving the perpetrators. Opposition allows victims to accept the harm done and explain that it will move them on, therefore it allows some sort of empowerment. We think this is specifically non-comparative. This is where I make both cases symmetrical and also break the deadlocks later on in my way. But we said it is non-comparative because accepting the harms isn't done exclusively through the process of forgiving. We see that victims can naturally realize that they have been abused and accept that it's happened, but not forgive the abuser because of the past harms that was inflicted onto them that caused great trauma. I could resent my ex because of what he did, but still want to still be a girl boss that knows my worth. We don't understand how forgiveness is explicitly one that empowers because resentment is something that can also cause people to feel empowered. So on the weighing then, I have 3 points of weighing here. First thing on coercion, second of all irreversibility, and last of all, even if like all the coercion and stuff didn't happen. First, on the first point, coercion, right? This narrative puts pressure on the victim to forgive irregardless of their mental state. Because forgiveness is generally the expectation of what victims should do, henceforth they should have the inherent leniency of forgiving their perpetrators to not be ostracized at societal level. Just like minorities having to forgive their victim because they do not want to be ostracized even more than they are in the status quo, and so they're more likely to give in and forgive them for and understand their circumstances. My second point of weighing then is on irreversibility. This narrative delegitimizes what the victim wants in the future. This is going to be addressing the POI as well. For example, right, if a girl is told to forgive and forget what she was was told to forgive when she was sexually abused, for example, as a child, but only realizes the actual harm when she was older, she has a lesser incentive when she's older to want to go back and to not forgive the perpetrator because society has already assumed that she already has to forget her abuser and don't want to open up her old wounds. This girl then has to live in a state where she lives in the trauma of her past, where with no one to talk to and no one to voice out of. We don't stand for this. And so even if their side is not coercive, their side is one that gives the choice that's irreversible. We don't stand for that in any way. But third of all, even if none of this is true and we wipe the slate clean, the act of forgiveness in itself is subjected to forgiving tokenistic apologies. What does this mean? This means that victims could forgive because of the social narrative, but the perpetrators that are apologizing or wanting to seek forgiveness doesn't actually want to change. Because the reason that the act of forgiveness in their side of the house will have to need big public displays of restoration at face value, real affirmative change might not happen underground, and it's something that they have no check and balances to work to because of how this virtue is run. That's going to be an umbrella virtue over all things. For example, right, an authoritative government could apologize to minorities for the harms that they've caused and give them monetary reparative aid for the harms to give them aid, right? But not actually give them their land back, for example, and continue to use it for urbanization while still displacing millions. And this case will be seen as virtuous because it's going to be something that they've already fulfilled their obligation and give them forgiveness as reciprocal duty. But in the same time, the minorities also cannot empower themselves because they're going to be one that's subjected to abuse or to subjected to more ostracization, to ask for more apologies, for example, and to ask for more privileges. Makes then the aid that's given by the government to be what distracts the people underground, when in reality these very minorities are still disenfranchised at grassroots level. And so we don't understand why they're most important. We see that minorities are overwhelmingly the victims of society with zero social capital or political capital to stand up for themselves, even in legislative paths or just like individual daily lives. But that means when people have like legitimate grievances and feel discriminated by the government, everyone around them will tell them to forgive and forget because it's something that's virtuous. And these people then will have to tolerate microaggressions, be victims of sexual assault, and still just told to get up and deal with it because it's the morally correct thing to do. The point is then, panel, is that in their side of the house, these minorities are pressured to forgive people when they do not want to, and the impact then is bad because it trivializes and diminishes a lot of the PTSD and real trauma that these people suffer, and also delegitimizes what they want in the future. And so for all those reasons, right, minorities will be people that are disenfranchised in their side of the house, and these types of effects are irreversible, and it's one that's coercive. For that, I'm very proud to propose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 6 seconds. Let's invite Opposition Whip to begin with his speech.
Hello, am I audible and visible? Okay, nice. Okay, I think I'll pull my mouse down. Yeah. Okay. Wait, yeah. I prefer my POIs verbally as well, and then yeah, I'll set up my timer as well. Yeah. Yep. So just POI me if you POI me through opening your mic because I am okay being interrupted. Okay. Wait. Yes, wait, yeah. I'll be start. Wait, sorry. Oh, wait. Sorry, wait, I haven't find my docs. Okay, so I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So today, for the whole case, from the first speaker to the last speaker, side government has only been talking about the negative side of our case and telling us how forgiving them won't change anything and it will put burden and pressure onto these victims and so on. But then they've never given us a positive case as to why on their side, without any forgiveness and letting this tension remain in the situation, it can benefit both the victim and the perpetrator. And how is it going to benefit the floor today, and how they're going to make a change and bring on a change and move on if people are continuously dwelling on this situation where there's crime cases that have happened to them and they cannot change. They've never proven to us as to how their side is going to benefit and how is it going to benefit, and it's not different from ours. So now with that out of the way, I'll move on to my rebuttals. Okay, so I have 4 rebuttals for their case today. So they say that first of all, people are getting forced to forgive, and then these are not sincere forgiveness. So we tell that this is not true. We tell how this is not true. First of all, true forgiveness is being judged by the victim themselves if they really put it down and or not to actually give it up. Even if they say that maybe they have artificially forgiven, in their heart, if they haven't forgiven, it's not they have not forgiven. And even if this is not true and there's actually artificial forgiveness where they forgive but then they're not actually forgiving in their heart, we tell you how that at least we are actually telling that particular individual to move on from it, because nothing can be changed on their particular case because it can happen. But however, as a crime as a whole, like murdering as a whole, we tell you how there are still changes to be made, even if it means that maybe these victims forgive a serial killer the pressure increases. We tell how the flip side is true and how on your side of it increases the pressure of these victims. We tell you how, because on our side we reduce the pressure by telling them that it is far better for them to let it down since young, so that because they know that they cannot change anything. So since young they are being maybe being forced to actually forgive, and then telling them that, oh, maybe I cannot change her, but then at the end of the day, I know that nothing can be changed on our side. But on your side, even if you don't forgive on your side of the house, it doesn't changes anything different, because on your side of the house, the pressure still remains, and even if, and then these victims still feel dissatisfied and so on. So it is not mutually exclusive on your side, and it's no difference from artificially forgiving, because artificially forgiving keeps the pressure there, and on your side, even if you never forgive, you still have the pressure on your side of the house. So it there's nothing changed. And as for your side, if you are talking about how you can advocate for a change because you never forgive, on our side of the house, we have already proven to you how CJS, criminal justice system, will actually still look into this situation, even so, because it is still a crime at the end of the day. And third of all, the forgiveness doesn't mean that you cannot show anger. We tell her this is not true, and then we see that even if forgiving means that as what they perceive as on their side of the house, saying that if this victim forgive and then they cannot show anger, but tell her, even if that's the case, we tell her a normal human or a vast majority seeing this, they can still feel bad, feel that this is something bad, because this is like a morality stuff, and then they will feel that there is something that's wrong, and then they will actually still feel unhappy about it, even if they really say, even if, like, how do we say, even if on their side of the house they are actually keeping this. So a normal people would see this, no thank you, a normal person will see this as something bad and definitely feel unhappy about it. Yes, even if the how do you say, even if the victim cannot show their anger or whatever, these other people will still advocate for a change, and then because they will actually still force this how to say, the criminal justice system for a change. For example, George Floyd situation, even if for example, this how do you say, this cases of how maybe the victims have already forgiven the policeman, but then we tell you how at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that people on the other hand, on other ground, would not advocate for a change. That's why we tell you how showing, even if they cannot show anger, it is still possible for a change and so on. And then justify the actions of the criminal because of how you forgive them and the thing is true. We tell her, no, this is very wrong in the first place because of how criminal justice system exists. And second of all, you have also public opinion, and you have also have this general idea that this is something wrong. And then even if the victim, even if these things exist, like how forgiveness exists, it is just to tell the people that this action is irreversible. No, thank you. This actions of this crime that happened is irreversible. It doesn't mean that people cannot change in the future, and it doesn't mean that, okay, if I forgive, is something right. So now I'll be moving on to the clashes. So are people going to take this crime as a normality, or is forgiveness really effective? So first of all, on the point of the crime taking it as a normality and people have crime happening, no. Right? First of all, criminal justice system exists. And second of all, even with forgiving, it means that they have to accept. Second of all, even if with forgiving, it means that they have to accept and move on. It means that they might not be able to change what has happened to them now or in the past, but they have the potential to change the future. On your world, on your side of the house, they'll continuously hold the grudge, and then they wanted to gain this justice on their own case. But then the thing is that even if they got the punishment for the criminal, and then they still don't forgive, it means that they have to bear the pressure continuously on your side of the house and never change for themselves. They might be pushing for a change for others, but they will never change themselves, and they will forever keep the burden on their side of the house. At least on our side, we reduce the burden on our people because at least they show that they have forgiven. And when people understand they must forgive, and then if they don't forgive, and on our world, people will have to understand that they must forgive. And because even if they don't forgive, time machine don't exist for them to change the situation. Then because they feel the unfairness happening on them, and then they don't want this irreversible stuff to happen on a future victim, they'll most likely focus on changing the situation as well instead of focusing on revenging themselves, revenging against the perpetrator, because they know that because they know that they can only they can only forgive the people and so on. So they know that when they have to let it down at the end of the day, they cannot change anything. They will focus on helping others to change others' situation instead of focusing on their own. Instead of focusing on something that they cannot change, they focus on something that can be changed. And then second of all, is forgiveness really effective? And can people really let it go? Yes, we say they will, because taking forgiveness as a virtue means that they're educated since young to not hold this thing as something that stops them from moving forward. And then because of this, they don't dwell and live in the present or past for not forgiving. And even if this is not truly so, or maybe they're still artificially forgiving, at least they've let out their minds, or through verbally, or maybe in thoughts, at the same way. And then we tell you how this even if it is not at the like 100% putting it off, at least at the very least, at least we can put out 10% or 20%. At least they can, and then when they're giving this feedback, they know that they have to respond, and then they have to, for example, forgive them in a way where at least they put out some of their burden on it. And then second of all, is it true that we cannot show anger and prove something unfair after we forgive them? We already told you on the change and also on these situations where how they cannot prove on the change as for the criminal justice system, and they can change it for the future and so on, and they still can show anger by public and so on. So we tell you how this is not true on their side of house, and therefore we tell you how forgiveness is effective. And now we're moving on to our worst case scenario. So even if at the very worst case that people does do artificial forgiveness and still keep the burden in their hearts and lose the main genuinity of forgiving, and the pressure exists in these victims, we tell you how, first of all, this is very unlikely to happen given that the forgiveness is never forced, and if they really don't have to forgive, no one can judge them on the vast majority and forcing them to forgive. And as for small matters like a scuffle, as for small matters or not, we tell you at least they're forcing people to forgive. We tell them to let down this situation. As for bigger matters, we tell you how at least it teaches people that changes cannot be made for the past, and then they tell them to accept the future. And then since they don't want this to happen on them, they will urge the criminal justice system to change. With that, I've never been prouder to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 40 seconds. Now that we have heard all the three debaters from both sides, 3 minutes will be given to the reply speakers to prepare their speech. You may begin now. Three minutes have ended. Let's invite the reply speaker from opposition side.
Hi, can I be seen and heard clearly? Yes, thank you. Sure. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. If a tree falls in the middle of a forest and no one was there to hear it or see it, did it make a sound? Side opposition is even worse. They see the tree falling, they hear the tree falls on top of them, and then they set the tree on fire. This is the world that they are creating with their case today. Okay, let's actually go into what has been going on with both sides. On side opposition, we told you about how forgiveness is actually the gateway, is a open gate for you, and also allows you to live your life as you want to live after everything wrong that's been done to you, right? However, government comes out here, they throw us out a lot of extremist examples just to prove a point. But we take this down very simply, right? We say people want to live their lives normally, but in your world, people are just going to be like angry dogs chasing each other and they're going to be living a life that still will never be changed. We will be living in a war if nations had the mindset of side government, right? But with forgiveness, victims can actually go on their merry way after forgiving instead of wasting their time and effort chastising every person of every color, race, and creed whose skin isn't pigmented with melanin for saying the N word, right? Also, government came up here and then decided to talk a lot about minorities, but we tell you about how people should actually be more inclined to wanting to heal on their own due to the fact that it's difficult living in a world where everyone is very, very angry with each other, right? Forgiveness shouldn't be retroactive because what's done is already done. That's not how forgiving is in the first place. It renders their arguments useless, right? And the people who actually were slaves in the past, they're all dead now, anyways, and that's the fact that we have to deal with today. Therefore, if we are able to be a bit more open with each other, then everything will be then things will be able to be solved even quicker and more efficient at the end of the day, right? Now, they also talked a lot about how we're going to be ostracized, we're going to be segregated. But we say on our side that we are going to win on this point because segregation is even worse on their side. It is not a harm that is mutually exclusive if they're trying to push it on us. It is even worse on their side of the house due to the fact that no one will ever want to forgive you because they don't even see the reason to. Because forgiving is just not a norm. Because there's just no benefit to forgiving because they stripped it of all its rights. They stripped it of all its goodness, and they say that forgiving is just a terrible, terrible thing, right? Now everything is just going to be in chaos, right? And we say that the amount of our people knowing the benefits we bring today is so much more better than not being able to even live a day where people are looking at you for being who you are. You have to understand that our society is a very difficult place to live in, right? And everyone is entitled to their own opinions. So therefore we say with this forgiveness, and this forgiveness being a virtue, it is very important that we start accepting each other for who we are, and then it will at the end of the day try to create a society that is not like the one that government is trying to push because they keep on saying that being angry is a good thing, right? Now let's talk about what are the two cases here. In our worst case, people cannot forgive, but we still say it's still better for the other people around them because this is ongoing, not in just one person, but in everyone, right? So if one person is unable to let go and unable to forgive, they're still at the end of the day going to know that okay, it's okay. This is forgiveness is a virtue, and this will be evident in their lives till the ends of the earth, right? Now, what have we told you today? We told you about how we want self-improvement and self-growth, something that side government will never be able to achieve due to the fact that they just don't want to accept that forgiveness is something that is ultimately good. We told you about how we want people to live their lives normally, something side government still is never ever going to achieve because they constantly live in a world where people are angry and people are thinking that, oh, we need justice, we need to fight, we need to be upset with each other. Therefore, you want to be happy, if you want to forgive, forget side with side opposition. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 16 seconds. Next, let's invite reply speaker from government side.
Hello, am I audible? All right. Just want to thank everyone for this debate. It's really nice. And thank you to all the coaches and all the debaters. It was a really fun round. Hopefully, this will be a great experience no matter the result. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In the words of David Africa, to forgive is to forget, is to forgo justice. Forgiveness is the action of accepting what has been done, understanding the life circumstances of individuals who were the perpetrators of the unfortunate victims, and eventually forgiving what they've done. To achieve morality is to obtain societal happiness that is to benefit society, or at the very least, not cause harmful impacts to the most vulnerable. The standard of harm in which we place for forgiveness, if it harms the most vulnerable, that is the minorities, and if it doesn't suit the interest of the forgiver in the first place, in which allows us our path to victory. With that said, allow me to bulldoze through their constructives. We told you that forgiveness worsens the lives of the most vulnerable, as the minorities and the victims, right? Moreover, we said that this causes more victims and causes an exacerbation of a negative stereotype towards the poor, and also causes abusive relationships to happen more often. Now, let us look at the reasons why opposition doesn't pull the criteria of morality. 3 arguments that they gave you, right? Firstly, on why forgiveness is not coercive. Secondly, on how forgiveness allows us to express ourselves. And thirdly, how society has better mental health. But before that, I would just like to call out that they literally had no principal arguments on the moral debate, where they give you a principle of how we should literally protect minorities and the victims of the status quo. Firstly, then, on how forgiveness is coercive, right? I think this was simply taken down by the very language of the leader of opposition, especially when they state that how forgiveness is a moral action that should be followed by society. Moreover, we say that morality is dictated by society, and how leader of opposition herself conceded to this because they claim that people who won't forgive are alienated from society. This literally supports our case. I'm not sure how they conceded their entire case in the first 2 minutes in a prepared motion. But second argument, forgiveness, they talk about how forgiveness allows us to express ourselves and move on, right? I just want to clarify that forgiving doesn't lead to moving on. This is because forgiveness is a process where individuals have to go through like emotional baggage. We told you that it was coercive, and there's no meaningful analysis as to why it is true that it was recommended by society and is encouraged from the team of opposition. There's no structural analysis whatsoever. The harms of forgiveness is irreversible. We told you in second and third speech. But thirdly, that society is better off. Panel, the minorities on their side are living under a dictatorship known as no alternatives. Andrea explicitly told you that authoritarian regimes are able to abuse this, and Zuhairi has told you how social movements are passive in their movement and could not advocate for change. In my speech, we flip their claim and say that anger is actually good for minorities to stand up for their rights, to fight for themselves after the centuries of disenfranchisement and oppression. Let us now escape from the harmful world of opposition and take a look at what we have to offer. We told you that social movements have a greater capability to fight for their rights and to fight for their human dignity. This was said in first and never meaningfully engaged with the entirety 24 minutes of their speech. Opposition would then try to engage on this, but note that there's 2 characteristics, like contradictory characteristics they fought for. Firstly, they said about how they want advocacy, but then previously they talked about how they actually want moving on. They cannot co-opt our benefits because advocacy undermines moving on. What they have to do is to defend a world in which minorities don't advocate for their rights. But we also told you that this worsens abusive relationships and stigmatizes the poor. The reason why the response provided by Deputy Prime Minister doesn't matter was because we gave you analysis as to how abusers were manipulated, and forgiveness reduces accountability for the perpetrators. So even if abuse happens on our side, the crucial tipping point was then on accountability and how we were able to punish the abusers. I just want to all of you to ask yourself a question before I end my speech. Why do you forgive? We forgive because we believe that people can change. We forgive because we know that people can make mistakes. But when the narrative was caused by people who were ill-intentioned and evil, we don't think that forgiving Ted Bundy was moral when he has used multiple people as means to an end. We think that's honestly demeaning coming from their side of the house. For all of those reasons, Miri is the team who truly understands that to forgive is to trap the prisoner in a cycle of regret and to realize that you were the prisoner. And because of that, we've never been prouder to propose.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 5 seconds. That's the end of our debate. Thank you to all speakers for a great debate. You may virtually cross the floor and shake hands. This concludes the final round. I thank the adjudicators and the debaters. This concludes the final rounds. Once again, thank you to the adjudicators for participating in the final. We are honored to have your support, and the competition would not be possible without you. On behalf of the organization team, we would like to record our deepest gratitude to all debaters for the great thoughts and participation. Let us all give them a virtual round of applause. Now, the judges will deliberate the results as we have our lunch break. The results will be announced this afternoon. The closing ceremony will begin at 2:15 p.m. Thank you and see you around.
All right, thank you very much to both teams. Wonderful rounds, and also thank you very much, everyone. The judges, I have moved them to the breakout rooms already. So what happened is that now we will rest, and also I will pass this to the technical team. How they want to take pictures or do stuff. I pass to the technical team from the organizing school, right? So I won't be here. I will be listening in the judging room.